Awesome. So this is being recorded, just so everyone knows as well. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. This event is brought to you by Coralwatch, Marine Society and the Sustainability Office as a part of UQ's Sustainability Week. We do just want to go over some image consent issues. So we will be taking some photos. We've already taken some photos. If you don't want to be in photos, you can just come up to one of the ambassadors or I and just let us know, and we'll make sure you're not in any photos. So we're here today to teach you about coral, how it relates back to COP26, and what you can do in your daily life to kind of work towards reducing your impact. Sorry, I just moved out of the Zoom frame. That didn't really work. All right. So the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. We also acknowledge the role the reef and coastal waters played in the culture of many traditional owners. Sweet. So with all that out of the way, I'll hand over to Sophie, who's going to be doing most of the presentation today. She's our Coralwatch queen, and she'll introduce you to the ambassadors that are also here going to be facilitating the activities as well. I'll just do a quick run over of how we're going tonight as well, what the plan is, before I forget. So we're going to have a presentation from Sophie for the first half, probably until for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A if anyone has any questions they want to ask. And then we'll do a little break. We've got some activities, as you've probably seen around the room. We're going to go over those. And then we have some food coming at about 7. So get keen for that. And yeah, I'll just hand over to Sophie now. Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, and special shout out to the UQ Sustainability Office for bringing this event together, also providing the funding for the food so we can all have some nibbles. Thank you very much. And thank you also for your effort in organising this too. So I would like to introduce my fantastic team. These are some of our ambassadors. We have Johanna, Kirsten, Tim, and Take, and they'll be running you through the workshop activities tonight. They are super cool, super knowledgeable people. So feel free to come up and ask them any questions during the workshop. And they're also just pretty cool to be around. So yeah. Also, if you forget our names, it's okay. Ask. I don't mind at all, and I'm sure these guys won't mind either. But yeah, this is our team, and stay tuned for more. But I might start on my section of the evening, which is the presentation. So we've got a bit of a mixed bag. I think there's been a lot of questions surrounding the reef recently. It's been in the news a lot, and there's a lot of mixed messaging. We're here to try and help you decode some of that, to offer you a bit of a scientific perspective on what's going on, and relate this all back to some of the big picture things happening in the global sphere at the moment. So a bit of an outline, talk about the Great Barrier Reef. We're going to talk some coral biology and what the actual bleaching process is. We're going to talk about some of the recent bleaching events that have happened on the Great Barrier Reef. We're going to talk about UNESCO, World Heritage, COP26, and of course, a bit of Coralwatch as well. What do we actually do? And then, of course, sustainability. How can we make a difference? So, Coralwatch, we were founded 20 years ago. Back in 2002, we just had our 20-year anniversary. Coralwatch is all surrounding this little tool called a coral health chart. And you are going to learn how to use those in our workshop after this. But essentially, the coral health chart is a tool to help monitor coral bleaching. We have over 8,000 members worldwide doing surveys for us, or who have done surveys in the past. We run workshops, teacher PD, and also we do a whole bunch of community outreach. We also have a database. So all of that data that you're collecting out on the reef gets uploaded onto a global database that's accessible by anyone. So anyone can download that data and do analyses on it. And of course, that means we've got 20 years worth of data. So if you go onto our website and go to the data section through the Atlas of Living Australia, you can actually see all of this data spread out around the world, where it's concentrated, particular sites. It's quite cool so go and have a look at that, check that out. And we also do a wide range of educational materials. We've published a book. We've got another one on the way, but more on that later. I also just wanted to mention the lovely ambassadors. So ambassadors are part of our ambassador program. That's a program that we run annually. It's our volunteering program. So if you are interested in becoming an ambassador, we're running our workshop for that in January next year. Applications open in December. Feel free to chat to any of these guys about it, or come and ask me some questions after. So we're just flagging that as an opportunity that's out there. Coral reefs. Coral reefs are pretty damn cool. Coral reefs are some of the most colorful and diverse ecosystems on the planet. So this is a whole bunch of close-ups of particular species of coral. You can see all the little individual coral polyps there. This is some of the fish you'll find on the reef. And this, my favorite, is some close-up of fish scales. I think the important message there, though, with reefs, if reefs disappear, all of this beauty goes with them, which is sad, but it's also motivating. I just realized, Jazz, would you mind coming and fixing this a little bit here? Because I think it might be covering some of the slides. Just the top section. I'm not sure if they can see that or not. Anyway. Coral reefs also cover only 1% of the Earth's surface spatially, but they're home to almost 25% of all marine species, which I think is a pretty interesting statistic. So the Great Barrier Reef, which runs along our coastline here in beautiful Queensland, is the largest reef in the world. It can be seen from space, and as many of you would know, it's not just one giant reef, as many people, I think, perhaps from overseas can potentially think. It's actually composed of almost 3,000 individual reefs, although that number does get contested depending on what you consider to be a separate reef. But also, there's a bit of an overlay there across France. So I think for scale, it really does show this is an enormous ecosystem. So biodiversity, that's a cool word. Diversity of species. We have over 1,500 fish species on the Great Barrier Reef, 400 to 500 different species of algae, 600 different species of echinoderms. So that's your starfish, your sea cucumbers, all of that kind of thing. So amazing biodiversity, and we're still discovering more species every day, particularly on the microscopic scale. We also have over 400 different hard coral species and a third of the world's soft coral species. So we've got tremendous diversity in corals here on the Great Barrier Reef. I think over in areas like the Caribbean, for example, sometimes they can have really high abundances, so lots and lots of fish or lots and lots of corals, but maybe they don't have the same diversity. So that's what makes the Great Barrier Reef really special as well. A note on corals close to home. Did anyone here know that we have corals in Brisbane? You can raise your hands if you knew. A few, okay, cool. We'd love to see it. So we actually have 120 different species here in Brisbane. We have a little fact sheet at the back. You can flip it over and see some of the different species. 42 in Moreton Bay itself, 120 out on, for example, Flinders Reef off the top of Moreton Island. Yeah, amazing. I didn't know that. Some really great diving here in Southeast Queensland. If you ever get a chance to do it, come and ask me about it later. So, a little bit on coral biology. Does anyone here want to have a crack at what a coral is? Any ideas? Yes, up the back. Correct. But all of these are technically correct in some way, but you are right. Taxonomically, corals are animals. They're actually closely related to jellyfish. Could I get one of my lovely ambassadors to bring me the model, the 3D printed coral polyp, please? So corals are closely related to jellyfish. If you turn the model of the coral polyp upside down, it actually looks a little bit like a jellyfish. But so when we talk about a coral, we talk about a colony of polyps. So the individual coral polyp, that is what it looks like. You can see some up on the screen. and they live together in a big coral. So they actually share genetic information. It's like a little bud coming off, but they are individual creatures that live in a colony that share genetic information, if that makes sense. So, and multiple of these coral colonies form a coral reef. Inside the polyps, there's a very special creature called a zooxanthellae, or recently symbiodinium for the scientists out there. But basically, this is an algae. It's a microscopic algae, and it actually lives inside the tissue of the coral. So you can see that there in some of those images, all those little individual brown speckles, that's the individual zooxanthellae that lives inside the coral tissues. This is really important because like a normal plant, they photosynthesize and they produce sugar, glucose, and they give that excess glucose to the coral. It's giving it food. In return, the zooxanthellae gets shelter and it gets a place to live. So amazing symbiotic relationship. And that is the cornerstone of a reef ecosystem, coral reef ecosystem. But there is an issue because corals can bleach, as this video will explain.
Coral bleaching has been a big problem for the reef for a while now. You see, coral gets its vibrant array of colours from algae that lives inside of it. That algae also helps feed the coral and gives it most of the energy it needs to survive. When the water heats up and stays warm for too long, the coral gets stressed and ejects the algae. The coral then loses its colour and starts to turn white. If the temperature of the water cools down, the algae can attach itself again. But if the water stays warm for too long and the coral stays bleached, it can die. Here at the Great Barrier Reef, mass bleaching first started happening in 1998, then in 2002, 2016 and 2017, and then again in 2020. Now a report from the Climate Council says it might happen again this year. Reef observers say they've already found patches of the reef that have lost some of their colour, and other parts that are completely white. Experts reckon that's a big concern, especially because we're in a La Niña year, which means ocean temperatures should be cooler. And they're worried that when the hot weather comes back, it could be catastrophic. They say the biggest contributing factor of coral bleaching is climate change, which is causing marine heat waves. That's where heat is absorbed by the ocean.
Okay, so more on that in a little bit. But an important message here, when the coral loses that zooxanthellae, when it gets stressed from the heat and it ejects them from their tissues, it's not dead. It can recover. So you can actually see it there, those transparent coral polyps. That's the coral still there, still on the skeleton, but it just doesn't have its zooxanthellae. So the important message is when water temperatures come back down within a period of about 2 to 3 weeks, you can see coral recovery. When it gets past that sort of 3 to 4 week stage of continuously high temperatures, that's when we start to see a bit more coral mortality. So these images were actually taken by Diana, my team leader here at Coralwatch, when she went up to the Whitsundays just this year. So there's someone out on the reef doing Coralwatch surveys. Something really interesting about coral is that they have this cool thing called fluorescing, which before they go fully white, they actually go neon colored. And it's incredibly beautiful in some ways. So you can see a few more examples of that here. And I don't know if some of you have heard of Johnny Gaskell. He's a bit of a reef legend. But this is some footage that he took this year out on John Brewer Reef. You can see it's stunning, right? Anyone would look at that and go, wow, that is an incredible reef. How beautiful are those colors? But the sad reality is that coral is that color because it is bleaching, or it's in the stage just before bleaching, where it's begun to get stressed. So some people think that these colors actually help protect against some of the really damaging effects of bleaching. So I think this is sort of the stage where they've lost some of those zooxanthellae, but not all of it. which really reveals those colorful pigments beneath. But yeah, it is part of that stress response. Yeah. A sad note. Nemo's home can bleach too. So anemones, other species like giant clams, anemones have zooxanthellae in their tissue as well. So these creatures can actually experience bleaching. I've seen that out on the reef. I've seen anemones go white. So if we lose those, we also lose the habitat for all of these other amazing species. So yes, there was a mass bleaching event this year. You may have heard about it. The reason this one was so scary was because we're in a La Nina year. So some of you guys might have heard about La Nina and El Nino. That's one of the dominant weather patterns that exists around Australia. La Nina years bring rain. Rain is supposed to cool down the waters, lower water temperatures, reduce coral stress. In the El Nino years, we get hot temperatures, dry temperatures, so we can get, large-scale marine heat waves. But this year it was La Nina, there was rain, we still got bleaching. That's the first time that's ever happened before, and that is pretty concerning. So a mass bleaching event is designated when multiple reefs in at least 2 of the 4 different management areas of the Great Barrier Reef are affected. So that's how we actually measure that. So the report later came out that up to 90% of the reef bleached in the most recent event, as you can see here on that map. So they can't survey all of the reefs aerially. They did about 700 of them, so about a third of the reefs out there, but the metric was 90%. Good news, low mortality. So 4 bleaching events in 7 years, pretty scary. We've had 6 mass bleaching events in total. The first one ever was recorded in 1998. Then the next one after that was in 2002. Since 2016, we've had 4 different bleaching events. So the rate at which these are happening is quite concerning. So what actually causes these? Well, might seem fairly intuitive, but we have carbon emissions from cars, factories, burning coal, burning gas, which cause carbon emissions. These go into the atmosphere, trap heat into our atmosphere and cause global warming, not just of the air, but also of our oceans. This results in an increase in sea temperatures. So at the moment, we're already 1.5 degrees warmer than we were 150 years ago. And as a result, we see an increase in the frequency and the severity of bleaching events. Okay, doom and gloom, but the Great Barrier Reef is amazing. It is one of the most amazing ecosystems on Earth. And because of that, because of these outstanding natural values, the Great Barrier Reef is also listed as a World Heritage Site. Now, World Heritage Sites go through a really thorough assessment process. As you can see on the screen, lots of different criteria. And they're managed by UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. But you may have also heard in the news, something is not quite right. So earlier last year, actually, there was a motion from UNESCO to list the Great Barrier Reef as in danger on its World Heritage listing. So what this would mean is that without further action, the Great Barrier Reef could potentially be removed from its World Heritage status. And this was because the body of UNESCO believed that the Australian government hadn't taken enough action to prevent harm to the Great Barrier Reef from climate change and things like runoff. Due to pressure from the Australian government, this proposed listing was actually overturned and postponed. So they stated that there wasn't enough consultation that went on with the Australian government and in terms of doing like in-person surveys on the reef. So the decision was delayed by a year with various conditions. One of those conditions was that Australia's report to UNESCO was due earlier, and UNESCO had to do an in-person assessment on the reef. So what actually happened? Well, days prior to their reef health report being due, the government announced another $1 billion for water quality on the Great Barrier Reef. billion over 9 years. But my question is, does this actually tackle climate change? No. Water quality improvements are great. We need them, but the big issue is climate change. UNESCO visited the Great Barrier Reef in March this year for an in-person visit, and this was actually while the reef was bleaching. The decision was due in June this year, and the meeting was actually due to be held in Russia. But for various reasons, that could not occur. So basically, it's a waiting game. We're waiting on the verdict from UNESCO. That's what's happening with the World Heritage status. What about COP26? So COP is a number of nations who, a number of years ago, signed a treaty on climate change. COP specifically is focused on keeping global warming below the critical temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. And I think this is relevant to reefs because that 1.5 degrees is regarded as a bit of a tipping point in terms of maintaining reefs in their current state. It's not to say that reefs couldn't necessarily survive past that, but what state are they going to be in if they do survive? So the 26th meeting of that convention was held in Glasgow. And days prior to this, Australia finally announced a target of net zero emissions by 2050. So they announced it. It's not legislated. And Australia is saying that it's going to be driven by market forces. So my personal opinion is that the Australian government wants to look like they're doing something without actually doing something. And at the conference, Australia also opposed various draft agreements to strengthen climate emission cuts. So that's a little bit on COP26. Good news though, literally just 2 weeks ago, AIMS, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, they run a long-term monitoring project on the reef. They have run that for 36 years now. And just 2 weeks ago, 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef recorded their highest coral cover ever. So really exciting news. The reef has really good coral cover. So that begs the question, how can we have high coral cover and bleaching occurring at the same time? Well, I think this graph explains it pretty well, and this is actually from their report. So the 2020 and 2022 bleaching events were very widespread, but they had low mortality. If you look here at 2016 and 17 on this graph, there's a big old dip. So when we have events like we had in 2016 and 17 that have high mortality of coral, we will see a drop. But we have been able to see recovery in coral cover despite these bleaching events because they didn't have a lot of coral mortality. So that's how we can have those two things happening at the same time. Remember, a bleached coral is alive and can recover. So the coral mortality depends on the severity of the bleaching event and also the temperature as well. So the temperature and the length of time combine to form the severity. The overall message here is, I know a lot of this can seem doom and gloom. Corals are resilient and they will continue to be so, but unless we curb some of those really big emissions long term, we are going to see continued bleaching. But corals are resilient. All in all, the Great Barrier Reef is too valuable to lose. There was an evaluation done that calculated 6.4 billion in terms of its economic contribution to the economy. I think that's every year. And its value as an icon globally was 56 billion. I think the other important thing here is that it supports over 64,000 jobs. And that's out on the reef, that's indirectly through the tourism industries, through cafes that support people coming to the reef. There's all different aspects that people may not consider that are indirectly actually supported by the reef. It's really important to our economy. And of course, 2 million visitors every year. The importance of reefs globally. So they're really important for tourism, as I've mentioned. Everyone loves reefs, everyone loves to go snorkeling and diving, but there are other things too. There's things like shoreline protection. So reefs save us from infrastructure damage from big storms that would otherwise cost councils potentially thousands, millions of dollars to repair. They protect from storm surge. They protect from the big impacts of those big storms. They're also really important in terms of natural and cultural heritage. So these are things like biodiversity. These are things like importance to First Nations people. Another one that people don't think of too much, pharmaceutical products. So I can't remember the exact details, but there was a drug created from cone snail venom, I believe, that's something like 1,000 times more powerful than morphine, like ridiculously strong painkillers. And so there's so much value out there in the reef in terms of all of these chemicals and substances that we might not even know about yet. And that's threatened by climate change as well. Commercial fishing, recreational fishing, commercial fisheries support food in our bellies. They support internationally, maybe that's subsistence fishing, so people buying food for their families. And also they're just an incredibly diverse ecosystem. So not just the corals themselves, but also all of the creatures that live in them. As I have explained, they are under threat. So does anyone know what that first image is up there? Starfish? Yeah? Does anyone know what type of starfish? Cots. It's a cot. It's a crown of thorns starfish. So people, it's being studied at the moment, but they believe that a nutrient runoff from agriculture is causing blooms of these things on the Great Barrier Reef. These things eat coral. So when they come through in plague proportions, they can be really quite damaging. Overfishing is also a really big issue. So, for example, if you overfish herbivores on a reef, that can be really damaging because algae grows on a reef. Algae can outcompete coral for sunlight. If you have a healthy population of herbivores, they will keep that algae level down. But if you overfish herbivores, you're going to see increases in algae growth and decreases in coral. So that's something else. Loss of key habitats is another issue. Things like the interconnected mangrove systems as well. So they can be a key nursery for fish. Even tidal flats can be a really important nursery. Salt marsh, it's all interlinked. Pollution and sediment, so runoff from various agricultural activities can be an issue. Minimizing pesticide loads, things like that. Storms. So one of the predictions for climate change is that cyclones are going to become less frequent, but more intense. So less of them, but when they come, they're going to be worse. And that can be good and bad for the reef. Good because it allows more time for recovery, but bad in the sense of when the destruction comes, it's going to be quite powerful. And of course, the big one at the end, climate change and coral bleaching, as I have explained. Another quick slide to overview this. Water quality, storms, crown of thorns starfish, and coral bleaching are the main threats on the Great Barrier Reef. So, what can I do? I know this can be a lot to take in. I understand that I struggle with it myself, but there are actions that we can take as individuals. One of them is Coralwatch. So, if you're ever out on the reef, you will have an opportunity to do this. And I'm not going to explain it too much because you're going to have these wonderful ambassadors to take you through it, and you're going to learn how to do monitoring using our virtual reefs. In short, it's a 6-point scale that actually measures the concentration of zooxanthellae in the tissue just by looking at the colors on that chart, and you compare that to the coral. But I'm going to leave that to the ambassadors. We have a database. If you go to the reef, please upload data to it. It's run through the Atlas of Living Australia, but you can access it through our website that is on all of our materials at the back of the room. In terms of actually visiting the reef, a few tips. Avoiding touching the reef is a good start. Physical damage to coral. Don't stand on them, please. If you're going to stand on the reef, stand on the bit that's not coral, that's just the hard substrate underneath. Using reef safe sunscreens is really important as well. That's been a big one recently. Using moorings instead of anchoring is, if you're a boat operator yourself, protecting herbivores, like I said, for the reasons that I explained earlier, and obviously preventing any pollution to the reef if you are going there yourself. More broadly though, what can we do? Well, globally, I think there's a pretty important need to reduce CO2 emissions. We're working on it, but more can be done. In terms of regional action, establishing marine protected areas can be a powerful tool if done correctly. MPAs need to be integrated in consultation with the local community, and that's a key motivator to their success. Devising strategies to reduce pollutants, working with local landowners. Instead of getting them offside and demonizing them, actually work with them. See how we can craft a better future together. Out there in agriculture, there is a lot of people who are trying to do the right thing, and I don't think it's constructive to just demonize them and shut them out. I think that the best thing that we can do is try and work collaboratively. Restricting other damaging activities as well. So illegal fishing, all of that sort of thing. In terms of local action, monitoring, education, and outreach. So monitoring what's going on in the water, educating people about what they can do on a one-on-one level, and then outreach to the community more broadly. Also, if you can't actually get to the reef, you can help save reefs from home. And this is one of the activities that we'll be running a little bit later as well, trying to think about all the things that we can do in our individual life, even if we can't get out there on the reef, even if we're not monitoring coral in the water, we can do things in our everyday life that will eventually help protect the reef. So our sustainability quiz is one way to think about some of those actions and all of these different spheres that you see up here on the screen. And we'll have a big discussion about that later. A few other examples as well. And you might see these lying around tonight. I really like putting these up on my fridge with magnets. I think that's a great way to have that little reminder there for you every day when you look at the fridge and say, oh, what's something else I can do today? And also something we've tried to emphasize here, I think there's a bit of a stereotype that environmental actions cost you money. Not necessarily. Sometimes they can actually save you money, and someone's gone and done the calculations for that here. In terms of raising awareness, we have also published a book, as I mentioned. This is Coral Reefs and Climate Change. It's a great resource for schools, for individuals. I'm not sure if you can access it through the UQ library, but there are copies that you can purchase through our shop. And we are in the process at the moment of publishing another book, Coral Reefs and Climate Change, What Can I Do? And this specifically focuses on 7 big spheres of action that we can take as individuals to help reefs. So watch this space. The message that I really want to drive home, that I think is really important, talk to your friends. Encourage each other, because you have so much impact as an individual. Within your peer group, you can have so much more impact than any scientist, realistically, because you're trusted by those around you and your words actually have more weight. They have more weight than me standing up here and preaching to you guys. You could go home, you can talk to your friends, and you can say, hey, like, Mum and Dad, like, have you thought about getting solar on the roof? Or like the other day, someone came up to me and was like, hey, like, do you have a compost bin? I was like, oh, no, like I tried to set one up in my first year, it didn't work. That conversation then prompted me to go and reset up my compost. That's something I can do, right? Those conversations do make a difference, and you have so much impact with your friends, with your community, with your workplace, and those one-on-one conversations really do matter. So encourage each other. Cool. That is the end of my presentation. I hope that we've answered some of your questions today. And if we haven't, we have a little Q&A session, and you can ask questions during the workshop. But that's a bit of an overview of what we've covered. I hope you know a bit more about World Heritage, the Great Barrier Reef, the bleaching events, but also there's a lot more information behind these slides that I did not have time to go into. So if you have questions on any of it, yeah, very happy to chat. Cool. Thank you very much. Yes. Oh, amazing. Very happy to answer online questions. Yeah, would you like to?
Okay, so we had a few online, which was amazing. So Karen was asking whether you guys are aware of the Queensland coral fishery and whether you're engaged with industry and the WTO process that the fishery goes through. When you look at the sustainability assessments by the department for the fishery, they've admitted that they haven't been operating sustainably ever. Do you know much about that?
That is not my area of expertise. So I would say, no, I don't know much about that. However, I think it's important to collaborate in terms of various not-for-profit groups. I think there's too much that happens where you're both working on the same agenda and the same issue, and there could be more collaboration. Coralwatch primarily works with corals. We work on climate change, we work on community engagement. So I can't speak to that issue and I can't speak to fisheries specifically, but I'd definitely be interested to learn more.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then Sophie also asked, when we're talking about the threats to the reefs, what about, I'm probably mispronouncing this, Drapella snails as a threat to coral reefs?
They are a threat to coral reefs. So Drapella are basically a little carnivorous snail. They feed on coral and they are a naturally occurring part of the reef ecosystem, but it's only when the reef system gets a bit out of balance, I guess I would say, that these Drapella grow in numbers and they can eat quite a lot of coral. You get little outbreaks of Drapella on a regionalized scale. So I would say they don't come through like COTS in sort of plague proportions, but on localized regions, they can be quite problematic, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So did anyone else have any questions in the room? We can pass the mic around so you don't have to yell. Okay. Just run it around.
Hi, Sophie. So you talked a lot about corals being a bit resilient, but are there some corals that are more resilient than others? Well, I know that there are, but what changes might we expect to see in coral reef communities into the future with these repeated impacts of marine heat waves?
I am so glad you asked that question. So this is one of the slides I couldn't include because I didn't have time. I might say that. Constantly. Perks of being tall. No, so one of the things that I wanted to talk about was coral reefs probably will survive past 1.5 degrees, but what state they survive in is a different story. So what Laura's trying to get at here is that certain corals are more resilient than others. For example, large boulder corals like Porides that are generally a bit more slower growing generally are more resilient. Why? Because they put their energy into their immune system rather than into their growth. And that's part of the reason why they grow a bit more slowly. So they have better immune defenses. They're less susceptible to disease. They're less susceptible to, predation, those sort of things. Whereas species, for example, like Acropora, are fast growing. They branch out really, really quickly. They can grow up to, I think, 28 centimeters in a year. So that's a lot. Whereas something like a boulder coral might grow 2 or 3 centimeters in a year, right? So these corals, the Acroporas, are putting more energy into their growth. So what does that mean in terms of climate change, in terms of these bleaching events? If you are more resilient, if you have a more resilient immune system, if you have a more resilient defense system, if you're more resilient in general, you're going to survive bleaching events better. So there are particular groups of corals, not necessarily just Porides or Acropora, but there are particular groups of corals that are more resilient. And so what scientists are wondering might happen in the future with these bleaching events, if we're going to see a shift towards those more resilient species and the loss of some of those species that aren't as resilient. So the coral reefs are still going to be there. They might look a bit different. The questions we want to know are, what does that mean in terms of habitat complexity? What does that mean in terms of the species that depend on them? What does that mean in terms of the overall reef ecosystem? So yeah, really good question, Laura. Thanks for asking. Any other questions? They can be big or small, it doesn't matter. Yes.
Hi, my name is Gita. So back in my home uni, we're having these coral pleasant fragments, and we take care of it like each month. And then there's one say that if you have one bleached coral, and it might affect the others, which means that others might get bleached as well. Is it true that bleaching itself is contagious to other corals?
That's a really interesting concept. I haven't actually heard about that before. I have not heard of bleaching being contagious. The only reason I could think that that could be the case potentially is when those zooxanthellae are released into the water column, if there's some kind of chemical signaling that goes along with that that could potentially trigger other corals around that, but I don't actually know. I'm happy to do some research into that and send you an email if you're interested. So yeah, great question.
No worries. Thank you.
I guess my bet would also be, rather than it being contagious necessarily, maybe they're just undergoing the same stresses and they're bleaching kind of because of the same reasons, not necessarily because the one next to it is bleaching. So a bit of a cause and effect thing, but I'm happy to have a look into that. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just wondering if you could tell a bit more about the sort of consequences that Australia and the Great Barrier Reef are going to face in case the Great Barrier Reef is removed from the World Heritage List of UNESCO. And another question is, there is another very important coral reef here in Australia, which is the Ningaloo. I was just wondering if Coralwatch is also monitoring that other reef.
Yeah, sure. Great questions. I might jump on the Ningaloo one first, just because I can remember that a bit better. So yes, I would say it is being monitored, but it's a citizen science program. So we don't have staff out there in the water monitoring constantly. We're a very small team. We have 4 people in our organization, plus a wonderful ambassador cohort. So the amount of bleaching the amount of monitoring that goes on is solely dependent on how many citizens we have out there in the water monitoring. So I'm sure it would have been monitored at some point, but I can't speak to whether it's actively being monitored now. Yeah. And what was your other question? Sorry.
What sort of consequences that Australia and the Great Barrier Reef are going to?
The World
have
Heritage.
Yeah.
So in terms of like once it actually gets delisted, I'm not sure. So my knowledge of the process is once the Great Barrier Reef was put onto that list for the in danger status, basically it would prompt more climate action, I would hope, because we would then become at risk of losing our World Heritage status. What that would mean, I think, would be impacts on tourism, impacts on, Australia's ability to claim it has a World Heritage site. It would have impacts in terms of tourism, because if it's lost its World Heritage status, that's going to be in the news. That's going to be in the news all over the world. And, we had those headlines going around a few years ago. The reef is dead. It's not dead. Parts of it were impacted. And it's spatially can be quite patchy, the impacts. So I think there's a bit of nuance to that story. But if you have a headline like the Great Barrier Reef has lost its World Heritage listing because Australia is not taking enough action, well, globally, we're not taking enough action. And also, things like water quality and the localized impacts, I think that would have a very bad impact for Australia's reputation internationally and also in terms of tourism. But yeah, I'm not sure in terms of like legal requirements or some of the institutional stuff, but just more broadly, that's what I think would happen. Yeah.
Yeah, to my knowledge, it's basically it would make us look really bad on a global stage.
Yeah.
And that's what the politicians care about, unfortunately. Yeah, so obviously also tourism and that kind of thing, but that's the main thing that that's why the politicians don't want it to happen, basically. Did anyone else have any questions?
Okay, so hi Sophie, my name is Jemima. So back in my home university, I studied shipbuilding engineering. So as we all know, when ships are built according to where it is going to sail, right? So like when a ship sails to areas that are filled with coral reefs, is there anything specific that the ship should have to help conserve the coral reefs itself? Thank you.
A really good navigation system, ideally. I think we've seen a few times in the news recently where, you know, tankers have gone aground on coral reefs and spilt, if they're carrying oil or, in especially bad cases, oil or other pollutants that can leak out onto the reef. I'm not an engineer myself or a shipping specialist, so I don't actually know of the specific instruments that they would carry, but yeah, very good navigation system, and also like the local knowledge to navigate through the reef systems. I know in Cairns, I don't know the name, not just Cairns, but more broadly, they have navigators who will actually come out to the big ships, get brought up onto the ship, and they will captain the boat through that particular difficult passage. So that's just a common practice that happens. But yeah, good navigation systems. In terms of like the cleanup for spills, I guess greater research could be done in terms of like, how do you manage an oil spill on a reef? How do you quickly clean that up? I don't know if there's something that could be done from the ship's side to prevent that leaking. Again, not an expert, but an area for future research for sure. Thanks for the question.
There we go. We also have a few more questions online. Karen was just adding to that last question saying a bilge system that doesn't drop pollutants onto the reef.
Yeah, that's a good one for sure. I think if there's a tear in the side of the ship, the bilge isn't necessarily going to do much. But in terms of like cross-contamination, not just for reefs, but also like bilge systems of ships generally, there's a lot of contamination that happens through microorganisms, various algae getting transported to different areas in the world through ships. So yeah, that is definitely a big issue. Yeah.
And Sophie's also asking, how does she go about getting a Coralwatch health chart and recording card?
I'm so glad you asked. If you are here in person, if you are going to go to the reef or you think you will be actively monitoring, we're happy to send you home with one. But for those of you that are online, we actually send out one free coral health chart anywhere in the world for a person that asks for it. So we ship internationally. So wherever you are globally, we'll send you your free initial chart. If you hop on our website, right on the front page, there's a section where you can fill in your details and request that. It will probably be me or Eleanor who packages it. But if in terms of larger orders as well, we do have an online shop. So we are a not-for-profit. We send out one for free. If you want more, you can buy them. We do, so yeah, have a look through our online shop. We do like the charts. We have our own slates for recording data, various different books, resource packs. We do teacher packs if you work in education, lots of stuff on there. But yeah, if you want a free chart, hop on our website.
Okay, we've got some people online who are very keen for that. So now they know how to do that. So that's amazing. Thank you. And we have one more question online. So Natalie said, I've heard that the Great Barrier Reef used to be further out to sea thousands of years ago when sea levels and climate were different. Do you think reef migration further offshore to cooler water is something that could happen in the coming decades as the reefs way to manage warming oceans?
Yes and no. So something cool about this is that process is actually recorded in Indigenous verbal history. which is, I think, is so incredible. So they not necessarily about the reefs themselves, but I've heard stories from people on country where their elders talk about the days that the waters came rushing in, or over, a couple of generations, how they had to retreat much further into the coast as the waters came in and in and in. So from a scientific perspective, that would be like exiting from like a glacial period as a lot of those waters melt, and we see that rapid rise in sea level. In terms of the reef part of it, reefs have moved locations in the past. I think previously, when sea levels were like 120 meters lower than they were at the moment, the reefs were actually out on the edge of the continental shelf. And if you go out on big ships like the RV Investigator and do scanning, you could actually see remnants of where those reefs were. Not 100% sure on that, but it has been documented. So I think the question is really around the rate of change. So we know with climate warming at the moment, the climate is, I don't have the exact statistics on this, but there was something crazy that's like the rate of carbon emissions, or it was the rate of carbon emissions. It was like faster than at any point in the last 800,000 years. Like, that's a long time period to be having that rapid change. So I think the issue is, compared to how quickly those processes would have naturally happened, our human interference is making those processes happen at like a lot quicker of a rate. So I think that's the issue. Reefs are adaptable. We could potentially see them moving to cooler, deeper waters. I think what we're probably going to see is migration further down the coast. And I know people here at UQ are actually studying that. They're doing honors theses on that. They're looking at tropicalization of temperate reefs. So, for example, reefs down here in Southeast Queensland getting more tropical species, getting more tropical fish species, more tropical coral species. So we're probably going to see that downwards migration more than out, I would think. Yeah.
So interesting. Yeah, I think I've seen things about like Moreton Bay being like a haven for reefs kind of thing.
They talk about climate refuges. Coral reefs also need to like form their own structure. So in terms of migrating out onto the shelf, they would need something to like grow up from, because they need light and they need substrate. So it's probably more going to be the downwards migration.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So we might just take, I guess, maybe one more question from in the room if we have any more, and then we've got one left online just so we can keep it moving.
We just need a break.
Yeah, so you guys don't have to listen to us talking anymore. Not that you're not doing an amazing job, Sophie. So Mohammed was asking, as Coralwatch is an international project and aimed at the citizens, how can translation of the Coralwatch manual to local languages help the project?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that question. And that's actually something that we do. So we have, I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but Coralwatch has been translated into multiple different languages. So the coral health charts themselves, which have some basic instructions on the other side, I know in our office are in like 6 or 7 different languages. So we've got like Bahasa from Indonesia. We've got like Cantonese and Spanish just recently. And we put an announcement earlier this year, like our instructions. So the actual instruction manual, we got that translated into Spanish recently. So there are options out there. However, I would say we need translators. We're a small organization, we're a small team. If you want to engage Coralwatch in your local community and you would be happy to collaborate with us in terms of translating those materials, we're totally open to making that happen and to increase engagement. So yeah, please get in touch. If you're a translator, we'd love to have you.
Did anyone else have any questions in the room? All good? No? Okay, awesome. Okay, well,
Thank you guys for so much for all of your fantastic questions. And also, if there's anything that pops up afterwards, chat to the ambassadors, come and have a chat to me. I'll be roving around the room. And thank you so much for your interest. I hope you've learned something. Cool.
night isn't over yet, guys. We're still going to do some activities and then we have food coming. So they should be getting here in about like half an hour or so. But yeah, so your Coralwatch ambassadors and Sophie can take you through the activities we're doing, but we'll probably take a quick 5-10 minute break just for anyone if you want to pop to the toilet. The bathrooms are just out that way around to the right. And then just come back and we'll just kind of like take a little bit of break and then we'll get into it. So yeah. Stretch your legs.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Oops. Hey everyone. Oh no. Is the sound off? I don't. Thanks, guys. Okay, cool. Yeah, it's not echoing through the room speaker anymore. Thank you so much for coming, guys. I hope you got something out of it. And Karen, I passed on your email to Sophie. And you can also just reach out via, I think, the Coralwatch email as well. Yeah, and you can reach out and Sophie told you how you can get your like coral packs and stuff like that. And we'll also put this recording probably on the Sustainability Office YouTube channel. If you know anyone who might be keen to watch it that wasn't able to come today, hopefully you can get something out of the recording. I know Sophie and I both like to walk around a lot when we talk, so hopefully the audio came through okay anyway. Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to end the recording and I'll end the Zoom as well.